Well, thank you so much for joining me for the 2020 State of Nebraska Analysis to Impediments of AI, or Analysis to Impediments of Fair Housing Choice, for the kind of the part of the whole consolidated planning process. We were in Lincoln last week doing this very same presentation. We had some good comments, and we hope to hear some excellent comments from you. Everything that I have in this presentation, which will be made available on the website, or you can send me an email and I'll forward you a copy after this. Will be already in the report. So really the main purpose of today's meeting is to share some preliminary findings and hear of any concerns that you may have, or comments, or insights into barriers in fair housing choice. Like I said, if you write them down on the question, they'll show up there, or the chat, or you can feel free to just speak up. I believe this is all being recorded as well. So that's full disclosure. All right. So like I said, the intent of this meeting is to review some fair housing protections, introduce you to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and its immediate demise, or nearly immediate demise, show some fair housing data and maps, gain some input on the perspective to help shape the AI draft plan, and emphasize the 2019 or 2020 now fair housing survey. If you haven't taken the survey, please do. We'll have the survey link for you here. And if you have taken the survey, thank you so much. Forward it on to your friends, your family, those in your professional network, anyone that anyone living in Nebraska that might have some input or just like to learn a little bit more about fair housing. So, fair housing protections, federal and state fair housing acts protect several groups in housing transactions. The federal rules are, federal protected classes are race, color, national origin, religion, gender, familial or marital status, and disability. There are several other states across the country or jurisdictions that have additional protected classes, but these are the ones that are protected in Nebraska. I have heard throughout my travels that this list is too short. Things that I have heard that have expressed need, and you may or may not agree with them, are source of income. I have heard as a protected class, so housing choice vouchers, Section 8 recipients. That is currently not protected. Veteran status, I've heard, should be a protected class. And returning citizens, or those with a criminal history, often face housing problems, or issues in securing housing. Those currently are not a protected class. If you believe they should be, we can add it to the comment. I just those are the most common additional protected classes that I have heard throughout my travels. But this is what we have in Nebraska as of today. So, State of Nebraska Analysis to Impediments of Fair Housing. This is a statewide report. If you were at my earlier webinar or saw me in Lincoln, the consolidated plan, which is kind of is kind of a part of, is just the non-entitlement areas of the state. All the data in this presentation and actually in the AI report itself will be statewide data, because fair housing is a statewide issue, especially in a couple of Omaha and Lincoln has some RCAP, ecap areas that we'll see a little bit later in the presentations. However, so entitlement jurisdictions to receive federal funding from HUD must certify that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing as a condition to receive grants. So it's kind of part of the consolidated planning process. It's outside of that a little bit, but it has to be filed at the same time. So over the past 20 years, AFFH meant preparing an analysis to impediments of fair housing choice, an AI. You conducted an AI, you identified barriers to fair housing choice, and you took actions on those impediments if any impediments or barriers were found, and you maintained records of those actions. In 2015, HUD rolled out a thing called the AFFH. And part of this AFFH thing, they changed a couple of the language. We have local knowledge, identify fair housing issues instead of barriers, and contributing factors to those issues instead of impediments. And we prioritize fair housing goals. Part of this whole AFFH rollout is HUD used this created an online assessment tool with all the data that anyone or jurisdiction should be able to use to identify fair housing issues and contributing factors. There was a couple issues with the data set. Number one, it relies heavily on the 2009 to 2013 American Community Survey data. Those of us who were around then, I'm guessing all of us were, because that wasn't too long ago. That is the height of the Great Recession. So the 2009 to 2013 ACS data shows a starkly different landscape economic, demographic, housing landscape than where we find ourselves today. It also used the 29 to 2013 CHAS data, Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data set. Again, that's a very different time and economic, demographic, housing trends that we find ourselves in today. So what we did is we reverse engineered all the data we were able to manufacture or reverse engineer in the HUD AFFH data set using the most recent census data and the most recent CHAS data. So we use the AFFH data frameworks, but with the most recent data, except for a couple indices that we'll see here that we had to use the original AFFH data set. So the operating context is a fair housing issue is a condition that restricts fair housing choice or access to opportunity. Alongside this AFH data set rollout, they had this kind of new concept called access to opportunity. And they were trying to measure quality.
On the other side of the courtroom.
Oh,
Well, yeah.
Sorry. So yeah, those are fair housing issues. So access to opportunity is kind of quality of life. They're trying to get a quality of life matrices and how those may vary based on race or ethnicity. A contributing factor contributes to, or perpetuates, increases the severity of fair housing issues that were identified in the first one. And a fair housing goal are things that are committed to and must be done for the AFFH requirement. Okay, so they put all that out. It was supposed to be easy for jurisdictions to do themselves, but it wasn't. It was rather confusing. A lot of the concepts that they tried to, include in this data set are just a little confusing, especially for the general population. There took me a little while to get my head around as well. I'll walk you through a lot of those. So they decided to suspend the rule. So until further notice, and they have put out a notice that they actually might just completely do away with all these things. But where we are now, we have to do an AI. We have to file it the old way, the analysis to impediments of fair housing choice, identifying impediments. But we have to do it through an AFH framework. So we have to include these additional AFFH data concepts that were put out in this online assessment tool. And we'll work through what those are and what they look like. So the AI AFH report will have an executive summary, and we'll talk about the community participation process, of which now you are involved in, which is great. Thank you so much for showing up. We were also, like I said, in Lincoln doing the same presentation last week. We had some great comments and great turnout there. We also have a fair housing survey running. The second time I said it, I'll say it at least 10 more times. If you haven't taken it, please do. If you have, thank you, forward it on. We look at past goals and actions, and we kind of see what's going on, and we have analysis, and we develop goals and priorities, and any appendices if we need them. The community participation process, like I mentioned too, is we have a fair housing survey. We had a fair housing forum, and we're having professional fair housing focus groups. We're at now. And then there'll be a public review meeting in March. So keep your ear out for that one. So after the initial findings and all the analysis and public input have been coalesced and distilled down into factors and recommended actions, we come back and we share them with the public and offer one additional opportunity for people to chime in on. So HUD's fair housing issues, here we have 7 of them. Our segregation analysis, they try to quantify this through what is known as the dissimilarity index. We'll run through that in a further slide. RCAP and ecap areas. So RCAP stands for, it's up here, racially concentrated areas of poverty and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. In the United States Census, as we'll see in a bit, you have a race and ethnicity, so they separate them out. Disparities in access to opportunity, and those are based on the several indices in the AFFH data set that unfortunately we were unable to recreate. Everything else we were able to redo except for these access to indices, but we'll work through them later in the presentation as well. Disproportionate housing needs relies on the CHAS, Community or Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data set that is produced by HUD for the consolidated planning purpose. It's a special tabulation from the US Census Bureau that HUD pays the census. So I don't know how that all works, but it comes out and it's a big lot of tables. C is for comprehensive, so we'll walk through that, but it shows housing needs by several household characteristics, one of which is race. So we can see if there's racial or ethnic breakdowns that are experiencing disproportionate housing needs. We look at where the publicly supported housing is. Is it clustered in RCAP, ECAP areas? Is it not? We look at disability and access analysis. A lot of people think about fair housing as based in race. Fair housing complaints, when they're filed, are actually, the majority of them are filed with a basis in disability. Persons with a disability that can't, reasonably accommodate their dwelling units or something like that. There's a lot of fair housing issues actually are disability or based in disability, as we'll see later, and fair housing enforcement, outreach, etc. So these are the issues that we're going to work through. Purpose of today's meeting, we review some socioeconomic context. We present a bunch of data. We do a lot of data analysis based on the census and the AFFH data set and the CHAS data, excuse me. We look at segregation and RCAP, ECAPs, discuss disparities and opportunity, discuss disability, and address fair housing enforcement and outreach. Like I said, this is a statewide report. Instead of the consolidated plan that we were focusing on earlier, it's the non-entitlement areas. This is the statewide as a whole, and we see a pretty decent, almost linear population growth rate for the state of Nebraska. It's good to go up. Population growth is a good thing. So that's a good slide. And here we go, population by race and ethnicity, 2010 census and the 2017 5-year American Community Survey. So anytime you see a table like this, I just want to walk you through how to actually read this table. So this is a 2010 census. The census is a count of all the people in the country or your city or everything. It's a total count. A 2017 5-year American Community Survey is a survey. So it's a sample size. They send out forms and people fill the forms back in and they send it out. So the methodologies are different. Because the methodologies between the two are different, you can't actually compare the numbers between the two time periods. So you can't actually look at the population in 2010 compared to the population in 2017 5-year ACS. But what you can do is you can look at the percentage of total and compare those across the two time periods. So we see here the white population in the state of Nebraska rose from 86.1% of the population to 87.8% of the population. The African American household or population also rose from 4.5 to 4.7%. And then we see here non-Hispanic and Hispanic, because in the United States Census, you have a race and an ethnicity. So you can identify as white, non-Hispanic, white, Hispanic, black, non-Hispanic, black, Hispanic. So you have both. The CHAS data set actually puts them together, which is a little confusing, but we'll talk about that later. We see here that Hispanic households also increased from 9.2 to 10.5% of the population. So breaking over 10% in the most recent 2017 5-year ACS. Now, when you take the census or the American Community Survey, they sum it together in what are known as summary levels, sum levels. The very smallest geographic area in a census is called the block, and that corresponds to a city block. City blocks are pretty small, so they add those up together. They add a bunch of groups of city blocks together to make a block group. Block groups are also still pretty small. So they added up to one more level. Let's see if I can get into the camera. There we go. To census tract level. Now, this is a map of census tracts. Census tracts are also, they add the blocks and block groups together. They try to get a roughly equivalent population in the size of a census tract. So that's why you see, census tracts in more rural, more sparsely populated areas having larger census tracts. Some counties only have 2 census tracts. When we get into Omaha or Lincoln, denser population, census tracts are much, much smaller to kind of equate the population size across the two. So we hear percentage of concentration of white households. Overall, we're seeing 87.8% of all population in Nebraska are white. So this is white population. There are some pockets reaching 99.1 to 100% white population. There are some the notable thing about this map is the lower levels where we have less concentration of white population here and over here, and then we'll see about that. African American population concentrated pretty heavily in just more urbanized areas. Omaha, it's kind of hard to see Lincoln and along the I-80 corridor. Hispanic population, also there's a couple pockets of higher concentrated Hispanic population. The blue purple is 49.8 to 80.2% of all persons in those census tracts are Hispanic. So that's actually a pretty big concentration area. You can see some here, there. It's kind of hard to see on a statewide map, but there we go. Oh, we don't have American Indian? Oh my goodness. I don't know why we don't have American Indian in here, but I can show like these two census tracts up here are high concentrations of American Indian population as well. And also on the border up here with the reservation. Okay, so, oh, things are going crazy. All right, this is poverty by age. In the 2010 census, they did not ask about your income. They decided to take the income question out of the census and put it in the American Communities Survey with the idea that it would roll every year. They changed the poverty question in the ACS data, so we weren't able to get anything besides the most recent ACS stuff and the 2000 census, unfortunately. Here we see the percentage of population in poverty for the entire state rose from 9.7 to 12%. That's a pretty big time period. A lot happened between then and there, so it's not too surprising that we see a poverty rate increase, although that rate isn't increasing too high compared to other places that I've seen. Concentrations of poverty throughout the state, again, census tract level mapping. We see here some higher concentrations, and this does have some higher concentrations of Native American Indian households there. You probably can't see it because we have the sign there, but there are also high concentrations, you know. Housing units by tenure. Okay, how you read this chart, this is kind of a nested table. We see occupied plus vacant equals total housing units. Total housing unit is a physical housing structure. It's a single family unit, apartment, mobile home, triplex, duplex, whatever. You can live in it, a boat, that's cool. That's in there. I did hear Nebraska has the largest coastline of rivers out of all the states in the country. That's the word on the street. Anyway, so once you move into a housing unit, it becomes occupied or a household, which is up here. And then if it's occupied, it's either renter occupied or owner occupied. So we see here that the percentage share of owner occupied housing fell slightly from 67.2 to 66% of the total of all occupied housing units, households. Conversely, the renter occupied household rose from 32.8 to 34%. This is the 2017 5-year American Community Survey. So it's averages over the last 5 years. So we do see, you know, it's still got a little bit of the post-recession or a little tail end of the recession, post-recession recovery. And we did see over that period people switching slightly from single family to renter units. However, so that's why we kind of see that bit of a shift there. Vacant housing units fell actually from 9.5 to 9.2% of the total housing stock in the state. So that's good to see that fall. Households by income. Now we do see here that the income of the households actually, you know, we do see less than 15,000 fell from 12.2 to 10.1%. And then that trend kind of continues. Most of the lower income households kind of fell. And then we see here at the very top end, 75 to 99 rose from 12.8 to 13.4, and $100,000 or more rose pretty big, actually 16% to 22.9% of the household. So we do see incomes, or at least income bracket, household incomes rising as a percentage share of the total population. However, this data is not adjusted for inflation. So dollars over here on the 2017 5-year American Community Survey are worth less than the dollars in the 2010 5-year ACS. So that inflation certainly plays a role in that, you know, increasing cost of living and things like that, but not that big of a jump. I mean, that's a pretty big percentage jump for that income breakdown. Okay, households by year home built, and we see here the majority, or you know, there was a couple years where housing stock was built. First one, 1939 or older, accounts for 20.2%, so roughly a fifth of all housing stock in Nebraska was built before 1939. And we see another kind of big building year, well, 1960 to 79. If you put those together, that's also pretty big. 1970 to 79, 16.3% of the housing stock was built there. So you see a lot of stock built before 1939, from the 60s to the 80s, or 1979, also kind of a big one. And then we see some additional units or bigger units built in 1990 to 1999 and 2000 to 2009, 11.9 and 12% of the Nebraska housing stock. So we see a couple of clusters of decades where we see some bigger housing stock built. So this is owner occupied by median family built, and we see here, you know, so just remember 1/5 was built in the 30s or earlier, 60s, 70s, and 2000s. So we see here the earlier stuff, 1939, the majority, not the majority, 1/5 of the housing stock had a median value of about 92,000. When we kind of go down, as the, you know, the year structure built increases, so does the median value. So we see another kind of bigger year in 1970, 79, 141,000 was the median value. Then we kind of go up again and we see the 2000 to 2009, 227,000, and things are kind of really increasing. By the time you get to 2014 or later, the median value of the structure built was up to $330,000. So that's quite a big increase. So basically, as the newer structures are built, newer units are normally bigger, and they command a higher premium. Okay, so now we're diving into HUD AFFH land. This is what is known as the dissimilarity index. This came out of that HUD AFH online assessment tool that they put together. It's a way of measuring, you know, it's a way of measuring segregation according to HUD. What it actually measures is how a lower level geography, how similar or dissimilar a lower level area compares to a higher level area. That's why it's called the dissimilarity index. In the legend, they use the dissimilarity index and convert it then to segregation. Okay, the formula that you use is over here on the right. If that's not your thing, don't worry, it's my thing. That's why I'm here pointing at it. Basically, it's, you know, it evaluates how smaller level areas, in this case census tracts, compared to the state of Nebraska. I just want to point out here that this equation is very sensitive to this I. I here we chose as census tracts, J is the state. If this I was a block group or a block, immediately you get higher segregation values. Instead, if we decided it's a statewide analysis, maybe census tracts are too small, we should just use counties. You know, there's 93 counties in Nebraska. We could do that. The segregation would immediately decrease because most counties look almost identical to the state. So we do census tracts as a happy median. It's just highly sensitive to that. I just wanted to point that out. We do, however, see once we run the numbers that African-American households have a dissimilarity index rate of above 60, which corresponds, according to HUD, to high segregation. But between 2010 and the most recent 2017 ACS, we do see a decrease, slight decrease in the dissimilarity index. We also see the American Indian households, we do see an increase rising from above 50, which is, you know, in the moderate segregation area, almost to 60. So according to the similarity index, we see increasing levels of segregation among American Indian, Native American households. Hispanic households, moderate levels of segregation. We're about, you know, under 50, between this 40 and 54 down here, moderate levels of segregation, and that remained pretty constant over the 2010 to 2017 5-year ACS. So quick recap, we see a slight decrease. I mean, highly segregated African-American populations, but decreasing, increasing American Indian segregated populations, and Hispanics moderately segregated, but remaining the same. According to the similarity index put out by HUD. RCAPs and ECAPs, we see here, RCAP is a racially concentrated area of poverty, and ECAP stands for ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. This again comes out of the AFH data set. Excuse me. And the equation to determine if you're RCAP or ECAP is down here. Again, if that's not your thing, don't worry. It basically says you have to fulfill two conditions. A census tract must fulfill two conditions to become an RCAP or ECAP. The first of which is you have to have a poverty rate of above 40% or 3 times jurisdiction average, which in this case was 12%, so that's 36%. So, or you must have a non-white population of above 50%. So if you fulfill those two conditions, a high poverty rate above 40 or 40% or 3 times the jurisdiction average, and a non-white population of above 50%. The reason that we have an RCAP is if that non-white population is based on race, or an ECAP is that non-white population is basically non-Hispanic. So that's why they're two. We put these together, RCAP, ECAPs, and we kind of blew up the map so you can see, otherwise they'd be totally lost. See some RCAP, ECAP areas, RCAP areas in Omaha and a couple in Lincoln. So there's just showing us that we have some higher, concentrations of poverty in non-white areas. So that's RCAP, ECAP areas. Okay, disparities in access to opportunity. So these again came out of the HUD AFH data set. That's why we're kind of doing the AI, but through an AFH framework. That's where these come in. Again, access to opportunity, they tried to measure a couple of different matrices about quality of life indicators. So they put them together. Quick note that a lot of these are very, you have to know what the definition is to get your head around them. They're relatively narrow in scope, so just be aware of that. So also, HUD wanted to normalize everything where up is good. So a high low poverty index is good. So the higher low poverty you are, the better. Low poverty is not as good. So school proficiency is up. School proficiency only evaluates the performance of fourth grade students on state exams. It has nothing to do with high school graduation rates, college acceptance rates, anything like that. It's just fourth grade statewide tests. Okay. Job proximity is kind of a function of its distance job locations with a CBSA. Labor market engagement attempts to measure human capital in the neighborhood. Now, the two transportation cost indices, the low transportation cost and the transit trip cost, only evaluate the transit costs or the transit trips for a 3-person single parent family with incomes at 50% of the median income for renters. So it's only renter households at 50% of the median family income that are 3-person single family parents. So mother or father and 2 kids living at 50% of the median income renting. And that's for low transit costs and transit trips. I think they wanted to do that because they wanted to dial in on the portion of the population or the selection of the population that needs to use public transportation to get to where they need to go. They might not have a vehicle or might not be able to afford a vehicle. So that's why I think they're trying to just be so narrow on those two transportation costs, the transportation costs and transit trips indices. Environmental health summarizes potential exposure to harmful toxins at a neighborhood level, but those are only airborne toxins based on EPA data, neurological, cancerous, and some other things in the air. Nothing to do with lead in your walls or lead in your pipes. So those are not indoor health hazards. It's a outdoor health hazard. So HUD puts all that together, and they give each census tract a score, and that based on this, and they also see what racial characteristics are in that census tract. So we do see here, according to the disparities in access to opportunity, that there are some areas where African American households and Native American households are suffering a disparity in access to opportunity. African American households are the orange yellow line, American Indian, Native American households are the purple line, and we see here that the white non-Hispanic and Asian non-Hispanics have a relatively high low poverty index, which is good. And then we see African American, Hispanic, and Native American having lower poverty indices. School proficiency indices, fourth grade tests, only fourth grade tests, but it's data. It is a data point, so we can evaluate it. And we see here that African households, Hispanic households, and Native American households all have a disparity in access to school proficiency indices. Then we kind of see here again in the labor market, same sort of trend where white households and Asian non-Hispanic households have a higher labor force indices. But then things kind of switch when we get into transportation and transportation costs. White households kind of fall below the African American and Hispanic, but Native American are still kind of low on those two. And we have jobs. The job human capital is kind of the same. I think that's the core-based statistic one. So that's just buy jobs or not. That's all pretty relative. And then the hazard index, we do see that Native American households actually live in the cleanest air. They have the cleanest air according to this. White households also have a higher hazard index, which is low hazard. Okay, so we do see some disparities in access to opportunity based on racial or ethnic groups, according to HUD AFH data set. Just want to make sure that I'm watching this and make sure no one waves at me. Okay, cool. or any questions. Like I said, if you have questions, just type them into the question box and I will respond to them. Be happy to do that. Okay, so now when we look at these indices mapped based on census tract, we see here this is a low poverty index, and we overlaid them on the RCAP, ECAP areas. So you can really see that, yeah, they have a low poverty index, which is basically based on the poverty rate in the census tract. So we do see, as we would expect to see, low poverty indices where the RCAP, ECAPs are, here in Lincoln and here in Omaha. But we see relatively, the eastern part of the state and along the I-80 corridor have high low poverty index, which is good, which is better. And then there's some, the more rural swaths of the north and the south, kind of a low poverty index here. School proficiency index, again, we see here, this is an overlaid on the RCAP, ECAP areas. And we do see low poverty school or low school proficiency indexes in the RCAP, ECAP areas in Omaha. And also, well, the Lincoln doesn't look as bad, to be honest. It's more kind of in the middle. We see here in the yellow for the Omaha region. But statewide, we're looking at statewide, we do see some areas kind of on the western portions of the state with a lower school proficiency index, and then kind of some mid-high indices there, kind of up here. So that's an interesting one. And on the kind of the outskirts of the urban area, we do see high school proficiency indexes. Labor market engagement index, pretty much statewide. In the more rural, everything outside of Omaha and Lincoln looks pretty purple and blue, which in this map is good. Then we kind of dig into Omaha and Lincoln a little bit. Omaha has some yellow, again, where those RCAP, ECAPs are. So those are some areas that are lacking in access to opportunity, and also high RCAP areas, so high concentration of non-white population, as well as a higher poverty rate. So those are kind of the disparities in access to opportunity indices coming up from the AFFH data set. We need to include them because we're doing an AI through an AFH framework. So there we go. Disability. Like I said, most fair housing complaints are based in disability, lack of reasonable accommodation, different terms and conditions relating to rent, those kind of things, service animal type things could be there. We see here the disability rate in the state of Nebraska as a whole is 11.5%. Male disability is 11.8%, and female disability is 11.1%. We do see here that as you age, the rate of disability is much higher. So once you get to 75 or older, 47.4% of all population 75 or older has a disability. The way you get in this table up here is you have one of these disabilities down here. Hearing, vision, cognitive, ambulatory self-care, and independent living. We do see here that ambulatory disability has the largest percent share of the total population. So 5.9% of all persons in the state of Nebraska have an ambulatory disability, followed by independent living difficulty. So if you look at ambulatory self-care and independent living, you can kind of see why the disability rate increases as you age. Living independently becomes difficult as you get older, and so that's kind of why we see an increase in the disability rate over as people age. Yes. One thing to know, a cognitive disability does not necessarily mean mental illness. Mental illness is unfortunately not necessarily in this table. And yeah, okay, so this is the HMDA data, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So anytime that you go to try to buy a house and you go to the bank and you fill out a mortgage application, they're required by law to track that data and send it to a government agency. I think it's now passed into the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, and then it's made available for detailed analysis. Fun note, if you're into data, the 2018 HMDA data set is way bigger than any other previous one. It's got a whole slew of new metrics that you can dig into. I haven't had a chance to do it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Anyway, so this is Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, but it's only looking at owner-occupied single-family, houses. So if you were going to go into a bank to get a loan to buy a house to live in for yourself, That's what this data is looking at. This data also tracks refis. This data also tracks, investment property, housing, and that kind of thing. This data is only looking at data for, owner-occupied home purchase single-family loans. We see here over the 2008 to 2018 period, the average denial rate, this is the denial rate, is 9.5%. So 9.5% of all applications were denied over this period. We also break it down by race. And we see here that the white households or white applications who came from white persons, were 8.9% compared to American Indian applications, 14.5%, African American 15%. So these were much higher, maybe not much higher, but they were certainly higher than the jurisdiction average of 9.5%. We see here Hispanic households that were attempting to get a home purchase loan for a single family house were 15.1%. So they almost had the highest, besides this not available 15.3%. So we do see some, so this would point to some possibility, not necessarily, I wouldn't say discrimination in the home mortgage lending industry. I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but maybe some disproportionate things. And we do have tables about why these denial rates, why the reason that they were denied, and normally it's credit score and things like that. So sometimes you can get these numbers down a little bit if you just offer some home buyer education courses, strategies to increase your credit score, those kind of things. Just strategies to kind of get to bring your credit score up. Might bring these numbers down actually. So some outreach and education. Oh, wrong way. All right. So fair housing complaints by basis. So anytime someone does feel like they have been discriminated against based on those protected classes that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, they have the right to file a fair housing complaint to HUD, and then HUD will track that down. We file a FOIA request to get the data from HUD. So these are all fair housing complaints filed by basis from 2008 to 2019. I don't think it's calendar year. I think this probably goes to September. I'll have to take a look at the exact month that 2019 goes to, but we said let's include it. But like I was saying before, the most common, basis of disability, so basis means like what your fair housing complaint was based on, is disability. 1,800 complaints were based on disability. 1,100 were based on race. You can have multiple bases, so you can, if you are an African American disabled person who's African American and disabled, you can file two, bases. That's why we see total bases higher than total complaints. Followed by national origin, so that's normally Hispanic, and then sex and familiar status. So the issue. So along with the issue, you have along with the basis, you have the issue. What were the thing that they were discriminating about? So we see here that 1,700 of the issues, the largest issue was discrimination in terms, conditions, privileges relating to rental. So a person with a protected class might have a different contract or different, terms on their lease in a rental housing market than someone with a non-protected class. The second one was discriminatory terms, conditions, privileges of services and facilities. So maybe parking or something, a communal pool or something that they couldn't access. And then the third is failure to make reasonable accommodation. And this one is, if you have a disability and you have the means to pay for a reasonable accommodation in your unit, and you must return that unit to its original form as you leave, then and if the landlord denies that request, that's a fair housing issue. And there we go. The fourth is discriminatory acts under Section 18, coercion, and discriminatory refusal to rent is the last one. So they just flat out refuse to rent to you if you have a protected class. So these are the fair housing complaints by issues. Now we narrow that down. We say, okay, so those are the issues. Those are the basis. These are just the complaints filed. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were found to have cause. These are just these are the fair housing complaints found with cause. So they were conciliated or successfully mitigated. They were elected to go to court. There's a couple different closure codes that we use to select out this table, but basically there's something happening with your fair housing complaint, it was found to have cause, so something happened. And we see here 898 of all of those complaints were based in disability. So again, those were found to have with cause, followed by race with 354, and then national origin at 249. Okay, so those are fair housing complaints and cause by basis. Now we get into the survey. Oh, let's find it. Okay, so like I said, if you haven't taken the survey, please do. If you have, thank you. Let's forward it on. Let's get this. Let's just blow it up. It'll be awesome. But we have 160 responses, which, to be honest, is actually pretty good. Sometimes fair housing gets lost in the shuffle, especially during a consolidated planning process. You know, we have another survey running, so to take 2 surveys, you know, it might take some time, but thank you for taking the time to do that. So we're at 160 responses, and that will hopefully only go up. We see primary role in the housing market. We have homeowners, local governments, and advocates, housing advocates. How familiar are you with fair housing laws? You know, not familiar, 24, somewhat familiar, 58, very familiar, 42. So that's actually pretty good. Missing is they didn't fill that one out, and we have 160 total responses. Please assess the level of fair housing outreach and education across the state. And we see here that too little is 50 and don't know. So people don't know if there's any outreach and education, and they feel like there's not enough. So this kind of points to you know, the additional need for outreach and education. I appreciate you being here on this webinar, because that is, you know, in a sense, outreach and education. I hope you're learning something about fair housing in Nebraska. Please assess the current level of fair housing testing in the state. Again, too little, 55. So outreach, education, and testing to see what's going on. Are you aware of any impediments to fair housing choice in these areas? And we sorted them by yes. So the rental housing market, people who took the survey, 30 people who took the survey were aware of impediments to the rental housing market. If you haven't taken the survey yet, there is a comment box, so you can type in what those impediments are, and we read that and we put that in the document. The real estate industry was the second one, 23, and the mortgage, home, and lending industry. Now, we did see some higher denial rates based on you know, race and ethnicity in the HMDA data. So maybe some of the respondents are aware of specific instances where that kind of thing happened. Are you aware of any impediments or barriers to fair housing choice in the state regarding, and then we sorted it again by yes, yeah, so this is sorted by yes. Limited access to government services, such as lack of transportation and employment services. And I believe that might be like an actual barrier a language barrier so that would kind of fall under national origin. We have some immigrant populations that cannot access government services or employment services because it's not in their language. So that could be a fair housing issue, or, you know, leases in their language. Neighborhood or community development policies, land use policies, and zoning laws. So these are kind of all, these next 3 are, you know, laws or policies on the books that may be an impediment or barrier. And again, I hope they you know, the people who filled out yes to this cited the specific instance or impediment that they were thinking about. That's super helpful. Do you think fair housing serve a useful purpose? 102 people said yes. So there's tremendous buy-in on fair housing laws, which is great. So people think they serve a useful purpose. They're happy that they're in the state. Are you aware of any educational outreach and educational activities or training opportunities? 53 people said yes, 39 people said no, and 21 people said don't know. So there is some people find it useful, and they are aware of educational activities. I mean, y'all are on this call, so I'm assuming you got looped into this through some sort of educational activity or opportunity. Do you think fair housing laws are difficult to understand or follow? Yes, 50 people said yes. No, 45, and then don't know, 29. So maybe again, this points to some additional outreach and education about fair housing laws, and how to, or what you can or cannot do. If 45 people have indicated they have participated in fair housing training, and you feel fair housing laws are adequately enforced in the state of Nebraska. This one, most people don't know. They don't know if there's actual outreach or enforcement or testing. Are you aware of any state fair housing ordinance or regulation or plan in Nebraska? No, and don't know. So I'd say, again, maybe some outreach and education about what the state of Nebraska is doing around fair housing. Are you aware of the state's policies and practicing affirmatively for furthering fair housing? Same sort of one as the top, the one before, 34 and 38. Again, maybe we need to get the word out a little bit more about what's going on with fair housing in the state. Are there specific areas in the state that have fair housing problems? Most people said they don't know, but the 18 people that said yes, I really hope they wrote down those specific areas, and I'm sure they did. Because that, you know, if 18 people or 15 of those 18 people all wrote down the same area, that's super helpful from an analysis standpoint. That's why it's nice and important to take the survey. Okay, so this is the Fair Housing Survey link, but I'm just gonna put up this little primer because again, this is a public input webinar. So if you have any public input, we'd love to hear it. You can type it in the question box up here or in the chat here, and then it will be transcribed automatically. Or if you'd like to speak, just you can raise your hand. I think I unmuted everybody, so you can feel free to talk as well, or wave your hand and I'll make sure you're unmuted. Let's see, yes. So yeah, so what barriers do people have in accessing housing? What groups of people have issues in accessing housing, and what can the state do to help eliminate barriers in accessing housing? So basically we're just asking about any input that you may have on fair housing issues, and here is the survey. I'm just gonna leave that one up there so you guys can type it in right now because I know you're at a computer. Well, most of them, I guess you could call this one in. There's some phone people here. Okay, and then, you know, if you have any thoughts, you can type them in the survey. So I'll just kind of stay here for a little bit and answer any questions that pop up on this little question pane, or wave your hand and I can make sure to unmute you, that kind of thing. Or we can all just have a most beautiful Thursday afternoon. It's totally up to you. Yeah, 1:17. So yeah. And then kind of the next, just to fill you in on the next steps going forward, you know, we compile the survey results. The survey stays open all the way almost until the final report. So after the draft report for public review has been published, the survey is opened. So, or the state stays open. So we compile this all together and we release the draft report for public review, I believe late February, early March. And then we have one more public input meeting. I'm pretty sure, yeah, one more public input meeting in March. Side note, I will be at the NIFA housing marketplace. Sorry, the NIFA housing conference in March. So I hope y'all can join us there as well for this and some other things that we do. Aha, question, thank you. How will all the data you have be collected and be used in the writing consolidated plan and annual action plan for the state of Nebraska? Okay, that's a good question. Thank you, Pamela. So we are also simultaneously with the AI stuff here, that we have here, we're doing a consolidated plan. And the consolidated plan has, again, its own public input process. We did a consolidated plan webinar this morning, and we have another one, if you're interested, next Thursday as well. So join us for that. But the data that we use in the fair housing and the comp plan is slightly different because the consolidated plan, we're just focusing on the non-entitlement areas of the state. So it's minus Bellevue, Grand Island, like state of Nebraska minus Grand Island, Bellevue, Lincoln, and Omaha. So this data set on the fair housing stuff slightly different than the consolidated plan. The consolidated plan, like I said, has its own public input process and its own survey. So you could take both surveys, it'd be awesome. So I hope that answers your question. We're running a simultaneous public input process and data collection process for that as well. And that's all going to be identified so that the consolidated plan survey is and public input process is based around, you know, consolidated plan funding needs and things like that, identifying housing needs, service needs, economic development needs. So that's how we do that. This kind of report is part of that process, but it's slightly in its own domain, especially since we decided to kind of split the data into two separate scopes. So I hope that answers your question. Man, I like these question boxes. That's great. Okay. Anyone else? Chat, question, raise your hand. No? Okay. Okay, well, I will just I'm going to put in the chat, I'm going to put my email. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, just please hit me up and I will send it to you. There's that. And then also, I hope you take a screenshot of that survey or type it in, bookmark it, so you can send it on. It's also available on the Consolidated Planning website as well, so that's all there. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone in March and you know, sharing some findings about both this and the Consolidated Planning process. Great. So next Thursday, we'll be doing it again. So if you want to hear it again, we might update the survey results by then. So that could be fun if you want to, you know, hear what's going on in real time. Okay. Okay. No other questions? I don't want to cut anyone off unless they have a question or anything. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, quote unquote, coming to the Fair Housing webinar for the state of Nebraska. Like I said, check in next Thursday. We have a consolidated plan and another webinar. If you'd like to hear some more, come back for those. Otherwise, we'll see you in March, and keep an eye out for the draft reports of both the comp plan and the AI release around then. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Happy Thursday.